Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Mike Posner, and as the oldest, somewhat active member of the department, I get to introduce the history of this lecture. During the heyday of behaviorism in psychology, Oregon was exceptional in maintaining a strong program in cognition. Bob Leeper, who headed the department in the 1950s and 60s, recruited his son-in-law, sometimes nepotism works, Fred Attneave, to come to the department. Fred's thesis had been on multidimensional spaces and their role in perceptual similarity, and was the inspiration for Roger Shepard's multidimensional scaling, one of the major contributions in the last century in social science. Attneave had just written a book, an important book, on the contribution of information theory, you all know about that if you heard the last lecture, to psychology. Fred was a role model for our department, very wise, modest, and helpful for all those who, like me, needed to ask for help. He favored a single department, not a federation of sub-areas. Fred thought deeply about psychological issues. Then, and possibly even now, when one wanted to study consciousness, they were criticized for having a theory in which a little man was inside the head, the so-called homunculus. It was typical of Fred to think deeply and write a paper in defense of the homunculus. It was an eloquent account of how the science could grow by showing how some things occurred outside the homunculus, thus helped to make a real science of at least some aspects of human thought and behavior. 30 years ago, we started a lecture series to honor Fred. Roger Shepard gave the first lecture where he credited Fred with the development of multidimensional scaling. And there have been many brilliant lectures since then. It has had many exciting talks, but there's never been a day quite like this one. Amazingly, in one day, due to powers I don't really understand, we have had talks from what are likely the two world leaders in the study of consciousness. Fred would have loved it. At 10 a.m., Stanislas Dehaene told us how the newborn brain processed language. And at 2 p.m., Christoph Koch told us what humans have that computer programs do not have: causal power. In fact, a demonstration of causal power was made by David McCormick, and that's why many of you are here. Now we'll have the third lecture in this series, our Attneave lecture, which will be introduced by the department head, Ulrich Mayer.
Hi. Yeah, so it's a really, really enormous pleasure for me to introduce Stan. When I first came here into this department, that was 1993 as a postdoc. There were many great things about being at that time in this department, but one of them actually was meeting Stan and Ghislaine here, and it was really clear I think for everybody who met Stan that this was a very special guy and was somebody worth watching. And I think one of the things that stood out for me is this really uncanny ability to take really big questions and boil them down in tractable experiments, pushing the currently available methods to their limits, developing new methods, but always sort of keeping the big theoretical question in mind, not losing sight of that. And if I think throughout his long career, one of the things that he went after were sort of the specific processing modules, the reading module, the number sense module, more recently sequential processing, reasoning, but always trying to explore how much of that can happen within the modules, like the sophisticated cascade of processing stages that leads from letter processing to word processing to sentence processing, how much of that can happen within those modules without needing communication across modules, in order to explore from which point onwards do we need sort of the magic of consciousness. And I think that's what we're going to hear today. Now, I want to give a little bit of a report card because it's quite compelling. Stan has a citation record of over 100,000 citations. He has alone as many Nature and Science publications as some mid-sized universities. He has, if you go through his list of awards, there are about 2 or 3 major awards in every single year. So I don't want to list all of them, but there's a Heineken award that I don't know whether it has anything to do with beer. The French National Order of Merit. There are several honorary doctoral degrees, the APA Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award, and more recently the Lundberg Brain Prize, which is a very prestigious award. But I also want to mention that throughout his career, he had a very strong motivation to relate his findings and scientific findings in general to a broader audience. So he's written several really excellent books. The one that I've sort of devoured when it came out was The Number Sense a few years ago, back now, but I think the findings have really held up. And so it's no surprise that he has been asked to head a national council that advises in France how to structure, how to inform education through scientific evidence, and something that Stan told me he takes very seriously. It takes up quite a bit of his time right now. So before I see the point, I do want to highlight the aspect that I can actually explain to Mike how it happened. Sometimes institutions operate without a frontal lobe, and even closely related units don't know what they're doing, and that can be a really good thing, because if we had planned it, we would not have sort of 2 of the greatest minds in this area in the same institution in the same afternoon. And so we do want to make use of that to some degree. So we're going to go through the regular Attneave lecture. We'll have room for some questions, but then Christoph and Stan have agreed to do a little bit of a back and forth. There has been some talk of kind of an adversarial collaboration of how they want to hash out through experiments their respective viewpoints. And so we might hear a little bit of that in sort of the final 20 minutes, half an hour. I do want to point out there we have some refreshments. It's going to be, for some of you, this is the second talk in a series of dense talks, so do make use of that, just try to do it quietly. So, Stan, I'm so happy that you're here.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's the first time I'm compared to a mid-sized university. So, yeah, Ghislaine and I were here 92 to 94, and this was a constant source of inspiration, in large part due to the presence of Mike. I think was a massive influence on my work, so I want to say so publicly. Mike, you published in 1994 a paper on consciousness, which is called Attention, the Mechanisms of Consciousness. And this was one of the papers, not the only one. I was also very influenced by the Koch and Crick papers. I don't know, Christoph, are you here? Yes, you are. So this was also, I think, pioneering papers that suggested, together with Larry Weisskranz and a few others, Emilio Bizzi and so on, that suggested that there could be a science of consciousness, that it was not completely out of reach. And this encouraged me in this line of research, which I think is, of course, preliminary, but already giving some results. So I want to start with something very ludic and simple. Many of you probably have seen this before, but if you have not, this is an illusion. What's the illusion? Well, you see a checkerboard. It seems perfectly fine until I draw your attention to the fact that at these locations, you have exactly the same luminance. It's the same exact gray level. But of course, when you look at the whole checkerboard, it looks like there's one gray, dark gray and one light gray cell. So what's happening here? Well, if you look carefully now, you'll see there is a sort of shadow. Of course, it's just a dark part in your retina, but your brain treats it as a shadow, thinks that the light comes from the right side, which is compatible with this brightness here, and there's a cylinder that casts a shadow. And so what your brain is doing is removing that shadow before letting you see the scene in 3D. It's also thinking that these are squares, by the way, well, they're not square at all. The point here is that consciousness is the result of a long series of computations. What we are aware of is not the raw image, of course. What we are aware of is subjective feeling, which results from computation. Another point also is that even a machine would probably experience the same illusion. If you wanted to design a machine that gets to the heart of things, what reality really is like, it should really recognize a checkerboard here and would therefore be submitted to the same illusion. In fact, more and more we think of the brain as a good Bayesian who is able to create accurate inferences about the external world, and that would fall to this sort of illusion. So these two messages, that consciousness arises from a long series of unconscious computation and that even machines could have it, will be a theme in my presentation today. I think that in general, the use of visual illusions is a strong path in understanding consciousness. And the argument I will be presenting today is presented in this book, Consciousness in the Brain, with some new results today. The first ingredient, I think, in the science of consciousness is the careful use of visual illusions. Paradigm that manipulate conscious perception, make it come and go, or change its contents as well. In this talk, I will be talking a lot about masking, where you flash an image, can be very short, and if it is followed by a masking pattern, typically here the letters surrounding the digit, then you might not see the digit at all. But it's still there, it's unconsciously processed, and if we space this a little bit more, then you see the digit. So we can study what changes. In the attentional blink, you get a series of, let's say, digits here, and there are some letters, and if you are distracted by processing the first letter, you might miss the second. It's still there, so why is it not being consciously perceived? There are several interesting points about these illusions. The first thing is we are really focused on the simplest meaning of consciousness. I think part of the problem of consciousness is there are multiple meanings. And here we simply talk about the capacity to detect and report a stimulus. The second thing is that this is all based on introspection. So introspection was long suspect in psychology, and I think there is no reason for that. It's part of what we want to study. In the case of consciousness, this is the heart of what we want to study, the very phenomenon that we are studying. So there is no shame in using subjective reports and introspection as long as we treat it as data, which is a point that was made by Dan Dennett. And in particular, we really do not want to study the objective part, we want to study the subjective part, so we can present objective stimuli that are constant, but if we present them at thresholds, sometimes they will be perceived and sometimes they will be not perceived, and we can contrast these two states. The fourth ingredient, quite obvious, is objective measures of brain activity. This is the place where I work and which I direct now for a few years. It's called Neurospin. It's a building which is entirely dedicated to measures of brain activity. We have 3 MR scanners, and I wanted to show you this giant magnet which has arrived now in the building. I didn't order it, but my predecessor ordered it. It will be an 11.7 Tesla magnet. It reached 9.51 Tesla last week, actually, so it's slowly ramping up and hopefully will be an 11.7 Tesla magnet at some point, but we already make use of the 3T and 7T, but also, of course, EG and MEG, and I'll be talking a lot about MEG, magneto-encephalography, as a way to track through time, much better than fMRI, what's happening with a conscious or unconscious stimulus. And so with these tools, we can ask what is the depth of a subliminal stimulus, what is unique, to conscious stimuli. So we can search for signatures of consciousness. The fifth ingredient, in my case at least, was being guided by a theory. And I was quite influenced by reading a wonderful book by Bernard Bass. I would still recommend reading it, 1989. But with Jean-Pierre Changeux and Lionel Nakache, we turned this initial psychology insight also into a neuroscience proposal, which has been called the global neuronal workspace hypothesis. And I will only give you a sort of outlook of it, but the idea is very simple. The idea is that there is a lot, perhaps, the dominance of processing in the brain is unconscious processing, and the brain can be described as a collection of processes that operate unconsciously. So each of these little disks here in this little schema that I borrow from Mesulam could be described as a brain area that does its job unconsciously, and there are chains of unconscious processors. But the claim of the theory is that what we subjectively experience as consciousness is, at some high level in the processing, the global availability of information, which is what Dan Dennett has called fame in the brain. The idea is that when we are conscious of a stimulus, what we mean is that this stimulus has made it into a central system, this global neuronal workspace, that evolved to select and to broadcast in a brain-wide manner a relevant piece of information, in particular allowing it to be reported. So what you see in this cartoon here is one stimulus progressing, let's say, along the visual pathway, achieving this high level of representation, but that's not sufficient. It has to be broadcasted to many other systems. Making it into this global workspace allows it to be, for instance, verbally reported by one chain of verbal processors, or to be stored in memory for a long time, and so on and so forth. So the claim here is that consciousness evolved as a sharing system to break the modularity of the brain. And what we call being conscious, this is very reductionist theory in a way, and maybe it will prove to be false, but the idea is very simple. What we call being conscious is having information in that state where we can share it. So think about it. When you're conscious of information, what you mean by this is that the information is available to be used in so many different ways. Now, in neuroscience terms, there is also a precise prediction here, which is this idea of ignition. This system is a nonlinear system. It has loops. It has forward as well as backward projections. And so information that makes it into this system will suddenly enhance its activity, will reverberate through these central systems of areas. And therefore, these workspace neurons that participate in these long-distance assemblies, they will all light up at the same time, propagating, broadcasting the message, the conscious message, and sending top-down signals to the underlying processes. So what we predict is a nonlinear transition in activity, where activity progresses and then suddenly explodes, ignites into this distributed assembly. Note, by the way, there is not much localization in the system, and I think there's been a little bit of distortion in the discussion. Of course, we do assume that prefrontal cortex is one of these important nodes, and in fact, several of these nodes could be in prefrontal cortex. But this is not a localizationist theory of consciousness. In fact, the whole point is that this is a distributed system. You need a system that broadcasts information virtually to any place in the cortex. And so, yes, prefrontal cortex is one key node, but for instance, I think people are discovering that the precuneus in the internal mesial parietal lobe is an equally important node for this broadcasting function. There is, in fact, a lot of related data and theories. I just wanted to show this slide, which is from the work of Henry Kennedy. This is the anatomy of the monkey, and from very careful tracing studies, it's claiming that there is indeed a bottleneck of areas, including area 46 in the prefrontal cortex, but many others that are tightly linked and form a sort of bottleneck workspace system. And people like Eugene Wang have been simulating the dynamics of ignition. We have too. So I won't show simulations today, but I think this system can be simulated and the dynamics resemble those that I will show you in the data. So we did many experiments on this over the years. This is one of the earliest experiments. This was with fMRI, just flashing a word and making it unconscious by masking it with these shapes before and after, or unmasking it by spacing the shapes before and after the word. So here you would just say there is no word at all, and here you would say, of course, I can see the word radio. It's the same exact words for the same duration, and when we did fMRI of this, we saw that there can be unconscious activation by an unseen word, for instance, in the visual word form area, which is really one of these modules for processing orthographic information. But when the word becomes conscious, there is this ignition of activity, and even the original processor multiplies activity by 10 or 12. So there is both amplification of the relevant processor, probably due to top-down inputs, as well as access and additional ignition to many other areas, including, in this case of words, the Broca's area, the inferior frontal gyrus. So this was the first sign that there could be this huge difference in ignition, but of course no dynamics here. So in order to get the dynamics, we wanted to record with EEG, and we used the nets that Don Tucker has been designing. This was also a big discovery of the years 92 to 94 for us here in Oregon, was with Ghislaine and I started to work with Don Tucker, and we imported the nets in France, and we began to use them together with MEG now. So in this experiment, we went to very simple paradigms where you just flash a digit, can be at several locations on the screen. There is a delay, and then you mask it with these letters that are just around the position of the digit. And when the timing is right, as a subject, I wish I could show you this demo, you just see the letters. You have a feeling there's just a blank in the middle here. There's no digit at all. But if you space them a little bit more in time, so you trace this curve as a function of time, delay between the digit and the mask, you see that subjects report seeing. And it's really a sort of all or none thing. Suddenly the digit pops as you space the target and the mask. So the idea was, can we track the consequences, or the brain correlates of seeing or not seeing? And it's very simple. All you have to do is measure the different brain waves that occur at different times, like 100 milliseconds, 140, and so on and so forth. And for each of them, you can ask, well, are they affected by this illusion, or are they just unaffected? Do they trace the same sort of curve as the subjective reports of the subject? So if you look at the P1, it's very strong, even in this 33 millisecond condition. And likewise for the N1 here, you see very little fluctuations here, a little bit of decrease for the shortest duration. But by and large, these waves can be completely intact, even under conditions where the subject reports that there is no perception of the digit. And in this experiment, we found that we had to wait quite a lot of time, around 250, 300 milliseconds, before we began to see this nonlinear threshold curve that is characteristic of conscious perception in masking. The threshold for consciousness relates to the presence of these late waves, in particular the P3B here, which really begins to have the same exact shape as that of the report of the subject. Now, in the recent years, we've replicated these findings many times, including with MEG, and we've been able to do source reconstruction of this activity. So this is a tentative of source reconstruction where you see activation in visual cortex and activation in prefrontal cortex. And you can really see these different stages in processing. In the early stages, you have activity which is evoked by the stimulus and which can be evoked even when there is no perception. So for instance, the green curve here is for short duration of presentation of the stimulus, 33 milliseconds. Most of these trials are unconscious. We can select just the ones that are reported to be unconscious. There is essentially linear activation, so there can be a strong activation by an unconscious stimulus. If we wait, we can see that this curve goes back to zero. And in the late stage, we see two things. We see this global ignition in prefrontal cortex in particular, as well as returning activation in the visual cortex. And if you sort of trace the curve in your head here, you can see that there is this sort of nonlinear threshold curve or sigmoid curve, where activation is really proportional to the degree of report of perception on the part of the subject. So we claim that there is both nonlinear accumulation of evidence. This is very familiar now, this idea of accumulation of evidence in perception. And then there is a threshold and an ignition if the stimuli pass the threshold. And this sequence of linear followed by nonlinear is clear enough that we can even see it in organisms that cannot report. So I'm talking about babies now. This is work with Sid Quider and with Ghislaine. When we do a similar paradigm in a little babies, you can flash a face, of course, instead of a digit. Babies are interested in the face, but can they see it? Well, we can mask the face and have a variable duration of the face before the mask, so a very similar paradigm. And we again see, even in the same electrodes here in the posterior part, we see clearly some linear phases followed by completely non-linear phases as a function of duration. And you can see that all of the short durations of presentation, in this case this is up to 50 milliseconds, they are back to zero in this period, while all of the other ones are significantly deflected. In this case negative, but the polarity is not important. So what is nice is that Sid Quider was also able to obtain behavior for the babies. They only move for durations of presentation above 100 milliseconds and above. So there is nice correlation between the baby's behavior, being able to orient to the face, and the presence of this late nonlinear ignition. So we think that babies are conscious at that age. Everybody, I think that this little guy is conscious, by the way. But how do you prove it? Well, This is, by the way, this was done in 12-month-olds and then in 5-month-olds. And probably you could do it a bit earlier. But the thing is that they have the same sort of late ignition that we find as a signature of consciousness in adult subjects. One key difference is the timing. You can see that here. It takes 3 times longer for the baby to get the ignition. So this is probably an interesting sign that all of the architecture for processing is there in the baby, but it's not myelinated, so it's much slower in accumulating and processing the data. But the same stages of processing seem to be there. So we continue this work with this guy, Jean-Rémy King, and with MEG. And Jean-Rémy brought some very interesting ideas from machine learning, this idea of decoding, which of course many people are using and had the idea at the same time. It is very simple. Is if I have temporal dynamic measurements, like I have these MEG measurements, I can use a machine to help me decode what's in the signals, whether the subject is perceiving and what he is perceiving. So I can take a slice of time, and in this slice of time I'll have, for instance, 306 sensors of MEG. I can feed them to a machine, try to decode what the subject has been seeing or what the subject has been performing. So I'll be making a lot of use of this method in this lecture. For instance, here's a curve for decoding what's the identity of the image that the subject has been presented with. Is it a face, a house, an object, or a body part? So of course, before the stimulus, you can't decode. This is chance level, 1 out of 4. After the stimulus, you can still not decode, and suddenly you see the decodability of the stimulus. And this curve tells you a lot about the progression of information inside the subject's brain. Even if you don't know exactly where it comes from, you know that the information is there and is being processed. And Jean-Rémy added some very interesting new idea, which is generalization across time. Suppose that now I train the decoder at a certain time, but I feed it with data from another time, okay? So I can see if the decoder generalizes from one time point to another time point. And imagine now that there's a chain of processing. So the information goes through a chain of processes, as I showed you in the cartoon slide of the model. Well, this is what you should get as a signature. You should get the ability to decode the information, but not to generalize outside of the diagonal, not to generalize to another time. Each of these moments you could decode, but it's a different code that moves from one area to the next. Very different if you had sustained activity, if you had one processor or set of processors sustaining the activity for a metastable duration, you would see this more square pattern. And you could train at one time and generalize at a completely different time. Okay. So very simple signatures here given by this generalization across time matrix. It gets even better than that, and we proposed it as a very general method to study the classical problem that Mike also studied in mental chronometry, the dissection of a series of stages in the brain. So imagine, for instance, you have 2 conditions now. You have one condition and another condition. You train on one, generalize to the other. You could tell whether some of the stages have gotten longer, have been lengthened by a particular experimental manipulation, because you would train on one time, but if you generalize to the other, you would see that the generalization is shifted off the diagonal because some of these stages have become longer and others have been respected. So this is a way to precisely know what are the stages that have become longer or shorter across different conditions. And you could have all of these interesting things, which are, I think, will be found in the data. So skipping a stage from one condition to the other would create this sort of generalization matrices, or even reordering the temporal conditions. So I'll show you examples of that in a second. I want to show you what happens in this masking paradigm. So this is the same exact masking paradigm I showed you before. We flash a digit, there's a mask, different durations of the SOA between the target and the mask. And now we decode whether the brain knows that there was a target or not. So target present versus target absent. Okay. This is very general decoding. So we can decode even for short durations. This is a little bit significant. And then for 33 millisecond duration, you can see that we can decode this sort of rocket of activation going through the system, going through many different processes. It's a diagonal process, suggesting that the information from an unseen stimulus is traversing a whole series of stages. And, this is going into the hundreds of milliseconds here. But we also see what's happening to a seen versus unseen stimulus. As we go to these longer durations, we can see the appearance of this more square pattern here in the generalization. And what that means is that there is now a much more stable representation of the stimulus. It's still changing, so there's a little bit more on the diagonal here. So we can call it perhaps metastable. And you can see that this metastability is much more enhanced for the seen stimulus compared to the unseen stimulus. So it's compatible with the idea that a seen stimulus accesses a stage of processing where the information is more sustained, lasts for longer, and we call it metastable simply because it doesn't last forever. It lasts for several hundreds of milliseconds. This metastability has been proposed also by others as a correlate of conscious perception. Now, Jean-Rémy pushed this idea a little bit further for his PhD, and we went even to much simpler paradigms and also to longer delays to see how long we can decode these dynamic trajectories for seen and unseen stimulus. So this is a paradigm that Jean-Rémy used, which is now using much simpler psychophysical stimuli. You flash a grid like this for 17 milliseconds, you mask it once again. There's a long delay of 800 milliseconds, and then you have to say whether the grid was tilted right or left compared to this probe, okay? So you have to compare it after some delay. And after that, you report the visibility with 0 meaning totally unseen and 1 to 3 meaning a little bit, a glimpse or a little bit more. So the first thing that we constantly find is that forced choice performance remains significant even when subjects report not seeing the stimuli. So there is something going through the brain, even in the unseen case. An unconscious stimulus can be processed along a trajectory and yield better than chance performance after 800 milliseconds. And the second thing is we can again decode the presence or absence of the target, and we do see this divergence between seen and unseen conditions. So we initially see the same exact amount of activation. It's compatible, of course, with the fact that this is the same exact stimulus on all trials, a fixed stimulus. But only on the seen trials we see this sustained activity, which decays a little bit slowly but lasts until the probe. For unseen stimuli, we see much faster decay. We still see some residual activity at the time of the probe. So this growing evidence that even an unseen stimulus can leave a trace through the system for a duration that is a little bit longer than what we initially expected, several hundreds of milliseconds, but it's decaying much faster.
Is there a spatial aspect to this decoding?
Spatial aspect, you mean where in the brain? Yeah, it comes mostly from the occipital areas, but notice that for each of these times, we train a different decoder. So the decoder itself changes, yeah. And it's complicated to get from the decoder to the actual sources. So here I won't show that to you. What I guess the interest of this technique is, and we are in psychology here, so I think this should be of interest to psychology, is you discard all of the details of the sensors and where they are and where they come from and so on, but you project the data back into psychological space, basically. You project the data into whether the target was seen or unseen, whether it was this or that. So you go back to psychological variables mostly. So, this figure here is really, I would say, Jean-Rémy's chef-d'oeuvre or masterpiece, because what he showed is that you can decode so much information from the same data. You remember there's a flash grid for a certain duration. We can decode all of these properties, 10 different properties from the very same trials here by building different decoders. So I just showed you we can decode the target presence, whether there was or there was not a target. We can decode early on the target contrast, whether it was high contrast or low contrast. We can decode its spatial frequency. We can even, but that is barely significant, decode some of its phase. But we can certainly decode its angle. And it's very interesting that angle is the one property that subjects must hang on to, and you can see that this is the one that we have sustained decoding all the way to the probe here. And by the time the probe comes here, you can see that we can decode the probe angle, the probe tilt, the probe phase, the tilt decision, and throughout this whole period we can decode whether the subject is going to report seeing or not seeing, although this is a slightly later appearance here. So this is an important message. From the very same MEG data, we have a lot of superimposed representations that we can decode here. But with respect to consciousness, what is interesting is that we can distinguish both objective decoding versus subjective decoding. So the objective decoding is we can decode whether the present-absent decoder, this one, is modulated by target contrast. And the contrast modulation occurs only in the first phase of the epoch here. You see under 200 milliseconds or 300 milliseconds and then decays very fast. Whereas we see this accumulation and then appearance of the decodability of seeing versus not seeing. So what the subject is going to report at the end, the visibility rating. So this experiment confirms that there are really these two stages. The sort of objective stage where you compute contrast and orientation and so on, and the subjective stage where you have the correlates of seeing or not seeing. The interesting thing that really puzzled us for a little while was how long we could decode an unseen stimulus. You see that this is very clear that there's a huge difference between seen and unseen. This is generalization across time matrices. So this was very compatible with the model, but this was a little bit more challenging. There is a trajectory of information processing, even for an unseen stimulus, for a long time. It's a diagonal process, but there's a little bit of widening of this diagonal. It's really like the unseen stimulus goes more deeply than we imagine, even though it's really clearly amplified and ignited for the seen condition. And I should say this is something that many other people are seeing now. There are several papers here, but the data on the right is from a paper by Baria and collaborators with BUH. And what she's been showing is that there is really two different trajectories for the seen versus the unseen stimuli. So the colored are seen and the gray is for unseen. What they are doing here is slightly different from what we are doing. They are doing principal component analysis of the MEG data. And so they're plotting the data as trajectories in the space of the first three principal components. And you can see that there are trajectories that are significantly long-lasting, even from an unseen stimulus, even though there is a sudden acceleration of the trajectories for the seen stimulus. So this acceleration, which we see here as the speed, I think, yeah, this is the speed, sorry. This is the diagram for the speed. They show that the speed of the trajectory has this burst around the time where we call it ignition. So there is really a divergence of these two trajectories. Seeing leads to a very different state of activity as not seeing. But there is also this lasting trajectory for unseen stimuli. That stimuli are just taking two very different trajectories. So this got us into thinking about working memory for unconscious stimuli. If there is really something like 800 milliseconds of trajectory for an unseen stimulus, could there be working memory for an unconscious stimuli? And in fact, at that time, there was some interesting, challenging papers suggesting that you could have behaviorally some better than chance performance for unseen stimuli, even after a few seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. So Darinka Trubicek, for her PhD, which she just finished this year, studied this phenomenon of unconscious working memory. And initially, I was very skeptical, but I want to show you that it does exist. There can be unconscious working memory under very particular conditions for an unseen stimulus. The idea was to have this same sort of masking paradigm with a long delay. Now, you can see the delay here is in 2.5 to 4 seconds, so really long. But initially, we flash a target. This is, in this case, a spatial target. We did that so that we have maximal decodability. It's easy to decode a spatial target. So we flash a target here. We have, again, short ISI. We have a mask. We vary the contrast of the stimulus. No, I'm sorry, the contrast of the mask. We vary the contrast of the mask across subjects so that we have half trials that are perceived and half that are not perceived. And then after this long delay, we have this forced choice where subjects are forced to tell us what was the location of the target, and then to tell us whether they saw or didn't see the stimulus. So we can have objective as well as subjective information. And the first thing is, yes, like the others, like Soto in particular, we found that there can be unconscious working memory after this long delay, in the sense that even for trials that the subject says were totally unseen, and we have this sensitive scale of, even a glimpse should give you a different response, or weak or very clear stimulus, we find that there is this distribution of responses at the proper location of the actual target, even for an unseen stimulus, after 2.5 to 4 seconds after the stimulus was presented, and under masking conditions. So this was behavioral confirmation of the initial work by Soto and collaborators. And in fact, we found that this has many of the properties of normal working memory. So it resists against distraction. We can flash a distractor in the middle of the delay, and we will still find this peak of unconscious performance at the proper location. We can load working memory, and it will still resist conscious load. There is just a little bit of increase in the dispersion of the spatial responses after loading conscious working memory. There is not much of a decay as a function of delay when we vary the delay, not by a huge amount, but just a few more seconds. We see a little bit of a decrease in the conscious performance, but not in the unconscious performance here. So there is the characteristics, let's say, of working memory, but for an unseen stimulus. But there could still be some worries, and we had two worries. The first thing is that subjects could say, well, this is an impossible task, so I'm going to categorize the stimulus right from the start, and I'm just going to use normal conscious working memory to hold that guess until the end. The other possibility is subjects make an error. They are asked to report whether it's conscious or not. Maybe sometimes they press the wrong key, and so actually it was a conscious trial, but they pressed the unconscious key. So these are problems, I think, with the initial work by Soto and collaborators. But we could solve that with MEG and show that, in fact, there are huge differences in ignition, in sustained activity and decodability between conscious and unconscious trials, which really validate the idea that these were truly unconscious trials. It was genuine non-consciousness. So there was ignition for seen trials that was not present for unseen trials. These are from some MEG sensors in the back of the brain. It's true also more in the front. We also see huge differences in spectral content, and this is another potential signature of consciousness here. The beta decrease in beta, alpha and beta frequencies, you see very clearly for conscious trials, whether, by the way, this is just perception or whether we are in this working memory task. We get the very same initial activation. This is actually important. This is perception, and this is working memory for the ignition component. It's not, one can view this working memory, this conscious working memory seems similar to the extension of conscious perception. With conscious perception, we get a short burst, and with conscious working memory, we get a much longer burst of decrease of beta frequencies. But none of that was present on the unseen trials. And in fact, unseen trials were similar to the absent trials. So this suggests, and crucially, it's even true when we select the unseen correct trials. So if these trials had been miscategorized by the subject, we should have seen the signatures of consciousness here, but we didn't. Okay. So there's strong evidence, I think, that these were truly unconscious trials. And likewise for the decoding, there was huge differences here. You can see sustained decoding of the location of the stimulus. This is the correlation with the location, the circular correlation with the location of the stimulus. You see that we can decode initially both seen and unseen stimuli, but once again, the characteristic of the seen stimuli, they are sustained over time. There is sustained activity. Although you can also see that they decay, and they decay almost to zero by the time we get to about 2 seconds. So the decay is a bit faster for the unseen stimuli than for the seen stimuli, but both decay, actually. So we are left with this interesting paradox. What could be happening such that an unconscious stimulus could stay in working memory for a few seconds, even though the activation decays almost to zero? And this is what we try to address in this paper. The paper is co-authored with Misha Tzodix, who is doing theory in the Weizmann Institute in Israel. And Misha Tzodix published this very nice paper in Science with, the first author is Mongilo, suggesting a synaptic theory of working memory, which could explain all of our results, including unconscious working memory. The idea is very simple, but I think it's powerful. And more tests are needed, but I think it's a very powerful idea. The first idea shared by everybody is that each content of working memory is coded by one cell assembly. So different contents in different colors here would be coded by different cell assemblies. The second idea is that memory is actually encoded by short-term changes in synaptic activity, synaptic efficacy. So there are two variables in the model that they are proposing. There is a model for the accumulation of synaptic efficacy in variable U here, and there is also a decaying adaptation, which is variable X here. And so what they are showing is that if you have short-term synaptic changes, as well as this adaptation, you can have initial activity, it can be sustained for a little while, but then due to adaptation, the activity can disappear completely. And you see the neurons no longer spike here. But because of the variable u here, they may still be maintained. And first of all, the memory may return spontaneously if there is a recovery from adaptation. In variable x here, you see this spontaneous recovery of the memory. So this would called refreshing in working memory. But also, a memory can come back if you send a pulse of activity from the outside, which is shown in gray here. Then, in fact, the information is still there in the short-term synaptic weights, and the information can therefore return. And so we think that this is a good model for conscious working memory, and we think that this is a good model for unconscious working memory. In the unconscious working memory, the stimulus traversed the network in a feed-forward manner. This was enough to change the synaptic weights, and so therefore there is a small but recoverable trace at the time after the delay. With a pulse of activity, you can force yourself to retrieve the memory. And in conscious working memory, it's not necessarily sustained activity throughout, but it's actually periods of silence followed by periods of rehearsal. And we all know as psychologists that rehearsal is a good model for what happens in working memory. In typical psychological models of working memory, like the Batley model, it's not completely sustained activity throughout, it's actually periods of refreshing. Well, this model has refreshing as a spontaneous mode of activity here. The model will spontaneously refresh, and even if it goes unconscious and inactive for a very long period, it will be able to recover some information as long as the synaptic activity has not completely decayed to zero, which will take several seconds. So it can explain why you have seconds of working memory without actual activity. So I wanted to show this to show that unconscious processing can be even deeper than we thought, actually. There can be a trace of memory for an unconscious stimulus. It's not an active trace, but it can become active when we recover it. There is one prediction of this model, which is that unconscious memories are dormant, just like any other memory, actually. So they are silent. They are not in activity state. So if you really needed to manipulate the memory, you would need to reactivate it. And you would be forced at that time to have the correlates of consciousness. You would have the memory back into a conscious representation. You could not manipulate an unconscious working memory because it's not in an active state of neurons. So we try to test this idea in a new paradigm. This is again the work of Darinka Trubicek. We flashed a location. We still have the mask. It's the same paradigm as before, except that now we have this letter here, which tell you to mentally rotate the stimulus, either right or left or not at all. Okay, and so now you have to actively manipulate your working memory. This is really working memory as opposed to just short-term memory in the previous experiments. And first of all, can subjects do this? Well, on the no-rotation trials, we replicate what we saw before, which is that even for the unseen trials, after a delay, I think, of something like 3 seconds, they still do better than chance. They report the location of the actual stimulus. But even more interesting, on rotation trials, they perform much better than chance. So this is the target. They have to rotate by 120 degrees. They have this significant bump of additional responses at the proper target location for a stimulus that they claim they have not seen with this sensitive response. And so this is behavioral evidence that they are rotating the stimulus. How do they do it? The prediction that we have from this model is that the memory may go dormant and may be completely unconscious during short-term storage, but it needs to be reactivated when the information is being manipulated. So at the time of this letter, and perhaps even before this letter, because it's a predictable time here, we should see a recovery of the signatures of consciousness. And so I'm going to skip over some of these slides for lack of time, but just go straight to the result, which is this result here. Now for the seen stimuli, we still see our very clear decrease in alpha-beta frequency, which is decaying a little bit and then coming back at the time of the probe here. But crucially, we also see it now for the unseen stimulus. And in fact, even for the absent case where they have to force themselves to give an answer here, you see that there is a disappearance of this signature during the initial delay, but at the time of the probe, which is here, we see it recovering, and in fact just a little bit before the probe here. So, and the same sort of thing occurs for the decoding of the stimulus. So if we look at the decoding on the scene trials, which I'm showing you now, first of all, the information about the target location is there, but then it decays almost to zero, again suggesting of this dormant working memory, and then it shoots back up again when the rotation cue is appearing, and subjects have to rotate here. And in fact, we can see information about the response location, which is a different code from the target location, right? These are two different decoders. We can see this response location emerging towards the moment where the subject is going to respond. And we can see the pre-rotation location is essentially the same as the target location because there are very few errors. So we see same sort of profiles for target and pre-rotation location. What happens on the unseen trials? We still get initial decoding of the target location. It decays completely to zero. And we see some of it returning. We see especially towards the end the information returning. But the key part is here. Is we see a rise of the pre-rotation location when the subject, this is the location that the subject should be rotating to give the answer that they are going to give at the end. So they're really forcing themselves to retrieve this pre-rotation location. We see a representation of it emerging in their brains, and this is the one that's going to lead ultimately to the response that they give at the end. So they are no longer under silent conditions. At the time that they have to rotate, they are under, it seems they have the signatures of conscious representation of the target. So we think that in this condition, a conscious rotation process is applied to a non-conscious stimulus. The target has to recover the status of a conscious representation before it can be consciously rotated. So I think this is both the power and limits of unconscious working memory. It exists. A memory can go silent and be unconscious and still be recoverable in working memory. But if you want to actively manipulate it, it has to be in active state. It has to be conscious. I want to give you a little bit more data, in fact, a little bit more about one aspect of this model, which I think is really nice and works fine, which is what happens when you have dual tasks. So this was present in my initial slide, but I didn't pay attention to it. But imagine you have two things to do at once. You have to process a first target and also another target, maybe with a very short delay. Well, the model makes a very specific prediction that there should be this bottleneck. If you access consciously the first stimulus, you should not be able to access consciously the second for a little while until this bottleneck of the global neuronal workspace is freed from processing the first stimulus. And so the predictions are very simple. There should be sensory processing of the first target. Let's imagine it's a visual target, so it goes through visual areas. Then there is this global ignition, and the model predicts that should go perfectly fine. But then if at the same time you present an auditory target, well, the auditory target should also be processed quite fine along its preferred routes, but then the ignition should be delayed until this one is finished, or it could be completely lost and may collapse completely because you are unable to recover a memory, a lingering memory of this flash target, and then you simply report that there was no target at all. So the predictions of the model that you should get either delayed ignition, which would reflect into the psychological refractory period, delayed response, or a complete collapse, and you would get the attentional blank. And so with my colleague, Sébastien Marty, who is here, we decided we should test this prediction. The first thing is that you should have these two phenomena on the very same sort of experiment. So this was the task. We flashed to the subject a series of letters, and their task was to decide whether there was a letter Y or Z. So at the end of the trial, immediately as soon as they saw the letter Y or Z, they should click to say, here is my target. But to distract them, we also gave them the task of attending to an auditory stimulus and deciding whether it was high pitch or low pitch. And we could track the representation of these two stimuli. So what are the behavioral results? Well, the first thing is that there is an attentional blink. So for the first target, subjects perform quite well, completely regardless of the delay between the first target and the second target here. So this is a manipulation of what is called the lag, the delay between the auditory stimulus and the visual stimulus in this case. So no effect on the first task, but a big effect on the second task. Subjects are not so good at processing it, but they're especially bad for short lags when there's a collision between the two tasks. But what happens if they manage to respond? If they do manage to respond, there is the psychological refractory period. So suddenly they are much, much slower. There is this huge slowing down, which reflects this collision here. So the first task is not affected. This is the reaction time to the first task. The second task is dramatically slowed and in direct proportion to how close the stimuli are. So when they are very close, there is this massive delay. I should mention, it's not on the slide here, but Sébastien Marty did these experiments about the introspection of the subjects. And quite interestingly, the subjects are unable to introspect about this delay. It's exactly what the model should predict. Subjects are not aware that there was anything waiting. What they are aware of is they think that the target was presented at the time when they were free to finish processing the first task. And this is exactly what the model should predict. You should be conscious of the stimulus only when you are free from processing the first task. So there is a subjective component as well to this phenomenon. So now we have blink and psychological refractory period. We can record MEG data and we can create decoders for the processing of the first task and for the processing of the second task. So these are decoders here that are designed to decode the entire task. So they're decoding when you're responding to the sound, whether when you're just listening passively to the sound, and we see this huge decodability of processing the first task. And we decode likewise whether you had a target letter, whether you had a distractor letter. And you can see these chains of processing, as I showed you before, for the two tasks when they are processed at long lags, when they don't interfere with each other. What's interesting is to ask what happens when they are presenting at closer and closer lags. What you can see is that the first task remains mostly on the diagonal here. So it's being unaffected. It's being shortened a little bit in its late stages. The late stages are disappearing. And this is, everything is squeezed a little bit towards the left. So you're processing things a little bit faster for the first task, but not the initial part, but the late part of it. But you can see this is very different for the second task. The second task leaves the diagonal completely. It's pushed to the right. That is to say, it's delayed massively, especially for the shortest lag. And when the subject reports not seeing the stimulus, there's just the tiniest little bit of activation remaining for the initial part here. I think I will not have time to show you all of the details of this, which is, exactly how each of the stages are being affected for task 1 and for task 2. So you'll have to refer to the paper for that. But just to show you this cartoon image of this collision between two tasks. So when the tasks are performed at long lags, they both proceed along their diagonals here. Task 1, which is the auditory task, and task 2, the visual task. But as we make the lag shorter, we can see this sort of repulsion between them, a little bit of an acceleration of the late part of the first task, which we see in blue here, but an especially massive delay of the second task. And notice that exactly as predicted by the model, the initial stages are remaining and they can overlap completely. They can process in parallel. So in the same times, we have the processing of the visual task and the auditory task here. But suddenly around 300 milliseconds, 350, you have this rigid shift of the whole task towards the right, a sudden delay of the whole task, the late part of the second task, the central part of the second task. So this is one of several experiments that we did on the PRP, also with a colleague, Mariano Sigman, that Mike knows very well. We were able to dissect what happens during this PRP and show that it's really just the central decision stage of the second task, which is being delayed by this phenomenon. Now, Sébastien went even further, and in a recent paper, the challenge was, here we are just decoding two stimuli, the auditory stimulus and the target letter. Could we actually decode every single stimulus in this fast RSVP stream of pictures? So this was the idea. We were going to show a whole series of pictures to the subject. This is 9 pictures per second, this typical rapid serial visual presentation. And we would ask, can we see the fate in the brain of every one of these pictures? So in order to do so, the stimuli became the classical, face and house and object and body part and tools, so that we could more easily decode them. But we would flash them very quickly. One of them was the target. It was surrounded by a green frame. And again, we distracted the subject by presenting a first color here and also asking the subject to report it. So at the end, they would report first the first target, second, the identity of the picture, which was surrounded by a green frame. But Sébastien built a decoder from the MEG data, and this is the decoder for the pictures. Actually, it's not difficult to decode which picture the subject has seen from MEG data when they are sufficiently different, like here. But the beauty is that we can decode now every single picture which is being presented to the subject. And as predicted, this is based on the early part of the epoch. So you see these small diagonals here. This is training. We train the decoder on completely independent data. We train the decoder on slower data, actually one picture every 500 milliseconds. And then we applied this trained decoder, trained at different times, to the task of decoding the RSVP stream. And what you are seeing here in color is how many times does the decoder say something that matches the first picture? How many times does it say something that matches the second picture, and so on and so forth? So the decoder, first, let's take the decoder at 170 milliseconds here. It says, during this moment, it says, oh, I see a house. Then it says, I see a face, I see a face, I see a tool. And essentially decodes every single picture which is in the stream here. There's another thing is that the diagonals continue here. So basically, if you cut a slice vertically here, you can see that for the very same slice of time, you can have multiple decoders. You can have a decoder, an early decoder, which tells you about the current image, and you can have another decoder which tells you about the n-1 image, and even about the n-2 image. It's actually a very interesting problem, I think, for the brain, something that we don't think enough about, that there are multiple stimuli inside the same brain at the same time, but they're all at different stages of this processing pipeline, this unconscious processing pipeline. This is all automatic processing along these diagonals. So now we can ask what happens to the target. The target is the one that subjects must attend, amplify, keep in working memory until the end of the trial. So this is the one where we should see our signatures of ignition and consciousness. So this is the target representation. This is the output of the decoder for the target, and this is the output of the decoder for the non-target. And they are not so different. All of the initial processing is identical, but the late part is different, and there are really two components to this late part. You can see here amplification of the activity around 370 milliseconds, and also amplification of the decoder outputs for the decoder that was trained at 170 milliseconds. So amplification of the late part and amplification of an early perceptual decoder. What's very interesting is that the two are different. The amplification of the early sensory activity at 170 milliseconds actually decodes not just the target picture, which is T here, but also the T-1 and the T-2. And subjects did make behavioral confusions in these targets. But the late part of the epoch actually decodes just the target that the subject is going to report, and not the others. So we think that we have evidence here for both discrete and continuous mechanisms of temporal selection. The posterior areas, which relate to this activation here, at 170 milliseconds, they activate automatically, but they get sustained for something that you're trying to keep in mind. But they don't give you one choice. They give you more than one choice. They give you the picture, but also the n-1 and the n-2. And the late part of the epoch is actually this discrete all or none ignition that selects one particular target. Do I still have a little bit of time, or should I realize that I put a little bit too much data, but I don't know where I should stop. Is that okay? A few more minutes? Yeah. I wanted to tell you that we can begin to look at this phenomenon at the single neuron level. Of course, Christophe started it all with beautiful work in collaboration with Itzhak Fried, and I was also with Rodrigo Cuyan Quiroga continued this work. So if this is true at the single neuron level, we should be able to see correlates of ignition, but also correlates of specific contents. And in this beautiful work, Rodrigo Cuyan Quiroga showed, for instance, that you can have neurons that are selective to a particular concept for instance, the concept of the World Trade Center, all towers here. But the neuron fires only when the subject reports being able to perceive that particular picture. So the trials in blue here are the ones where the subject reported seeing the stimulus, and essentially this neuron fired almost exclusively when there was, when there was a target, when there was a perceivable picture here. So the trials in red, there is no firing. The subject said, I couldn't see the picture. It was presented too quickly, and it was masked. I didn't have time to see it. So this is a correlate of masking in the late activity in the anterior temporal cortex, here in high-level associative temporal cortex. A lot more work was done in this area, and this is one where they used ambiguous figures. This is quite entertaining. Actually, this is a morph between Bob Marley and Whoopi Goldberg. I hope you can see both a little bit. So what they showed is that if you bias this, the trial for subjects to report one or the other, this neuron will fire only when the subject sees Whoopi Goldberg and not when the subject sees Bob Marley. So it's a correlate of subjective perception independently of the objective stimulus, which is fixed. This is all in temporal cortex because this is where most of the recordings are done in humans. But in fact, in prefrontal cortex and also in a no-report paradigm, this beautiful work by Fanis Panagiotaropoulos, who is now in Neurospin, but did this work with Nikos Logothetis in a monkey in prefrontal cortex. They found this firing correlating with the subjective perception in rivalry paradigms, including binocular flash suppression and also just classical binocular rivalry. So it's very clear that there are cell assemblies in the prefrontal cortex that care about which stimulus is being seen by the subject. They actually encode the seen stimulus. There is no reporting by the monkey. It's a no-report paradigm. And this firing occurs only for the image which is seen, not the image which is not seen. But what these paradigms do not do is show you the propagation of activity from the back to the front and exactly at which moment it becomes conscious. So I was lucky enough to collaborate, and this will be the last piece of data I will show you. I could collaborate with Peter Roefsema, and Bram van Vogt did this experiment to track the fate of a seen versus unseen stimulus in spiking neuronal activity in the monkey. So in order for this to work in the monkey, the paradigm has to be simplified. It's a very simple paradigm here. The monkey fixates on a red spot, and the neuron has a receptive field. It could be in V1, V4, PFC. And so we'll flash a stimulus in the receptive field, in which case the monkey has to make a saccade to that stimulus. But the stimulus is dim, and there are also trials where there is no stimulus at all, and the monkey has been trained that if there is no stimulus at all, he should make a saccade to a fixed dot, which is being called a reject dot. So this is reporting, I didn't see a stimulus. This is reporting, I saw a stimulus. There was one in my receptive field for the neuron here. And once again, you get these beautiful sigmoidal curves. There is really a threshold for conscious perception in this sort of paradigm. So you have to have a minimal level of contrast before you get the monkey to saccade reproducibly to the target. And this is a percentage of saccades to the target stimulus. So the work was aiming at answering the following questions. Where in the visual hierarchy do the subliminal stimuli get lost? Which neuronal mechanisms underlie the threshold for reporting the stimulus? And what are the sources of fluctuation that make this curve not a square one, but so there is a fixed stimulus that sometimes crosses or fails to cross the threshold? And data is quite beautiful. So what they did was they recorded from V1, V4, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, multi-unit recordings as a function of time. And I will just explain to you this complex diagram, but it's quite simple. So these are the low contrast trials. In the case of the low contrast trials, you can see that, first of all, you can detect activity for a seen and for a miss stimulus. So this is seen is in green and miss is in red here. But you see that the missed stimuli, the trials that the subject does not make a saccade to and therefore does not report, are ones that don't quite make it into V4 and even less into dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay? So there's a failure of transmission from V1 to V4 here. But for the higher, intermediate or higher contrast, so this is a medium contrast or a higher contrast stimulus, what you can see is quite different. There's a lot of activation V1, there's a lot of activation V4, even for a completely missed stimulus. You can get this very high level of activation in the red curve here. But there's a complete loss of transmission to the late part of the activity in prefrontal cortex. You can see the beginning of activity. So this is what we call failed ignition. you can drive the system up a little bit. The red curve shoots up, but then it goes back down. Okay. And this is exactly what a dynamic system does. We can simulate this. If you have a dynamic system with two attractors, you can get it closer to the high attractor, but then it drops back down. Okay? And this is exactly why you have a threshold here. So the activity shoots up only for the trials that the subject is reporting. And you can see that even the false alarms actually show this signature in prefrontal cortex here of building up of activity to a high level on the trials where the monkey will make a false alarm. So we can make several arguments here. The first one is that V1 and V4 cannot be the basis of conscious reportability because they can have exactly the same level of activity on trials that are or are not reported by the monkey. And they show this transient, feed-forward, unconscious activity. The second thing is the correlate of reporting is really the ignition of prefrontal cortex when the monkey reports perceiving a stimulus. And this fits very nicely with this idea of, a wave of activation that can last long but gets lost. Can even activate prefrontal cortex, but then it gets lost in the late part under subliminal processing. And the stimuli, if they are too weak, they will get lost early between V1 and V4. But if they are strong enough, they will activate a long wave that may still fail to activate this late ignition. And contrariwise, the mechanism of the threshold is really the crossing of this nonlinear activation in prefrontal cortex. We can simulate all of this with a very simple sort of cartoon model, so where there is feed-forward propagation, as well as feedback and self-excitation here. And all of the properties that I just show you in the real data are reproduced by this very simple model, which is in the paper. What you can see is we reproduce the perception curve of the monkey, but also what's interesting about such a model is you draw your attention to some interesting properties of the actual data. So the model predicts that there should be top-down amplification, even if you're back in V4 or even if you're back in V1, there should be this late part of the epoch where you see a little bit of activation for the SYN and even for the false alarm trials, top-down amplification from, in this model, parietal and prefrontal cortex. So is this in the data? Yes. If you go back to the data, you can see that in the late part, there is actually a separation between the seen trials and the unseen trials, with just a little tiny bit of additional spikes on the seen trials. The other thing that the model can explain is this sort of ramping behavior that we see on the false alarms. This is a little bit surprising because the model is all about nonlinear ignition. So why is there this slow ramping? Well, in the model, actually, it's completely explained by averaging at different times. If you think about it, in the false alarm traces, there is no target, but for a delay, So the model can fire at any time, can ignite at any time, and we don't know at which time it will ignite. So if you average across these trials, it will create this apparent ramping, but it's actually due to the fact that on single trials, there is actually ignition at a precise time, but we don't know when. So this was a rather good explanation for what we saw in the data. The last thing I want to say about this data is consciousness occurs at a particular moment, but it can be predicted. And Peter Rufsema was able, with Stefano Panzeri, to actually analyze what causes, to some extent, the fluctuations in the perception for a fixed stimulus. We don't always perceive the same stimulus. Sometimes it ignites, sometimes it doesn't. So why is that? So what they did was to analyze many pre-stimulus measures, the motivation of the monkey, the time to initiate a trial, the pupil diameter, state of vigilance or something like that, the firing rate, the baseline firing rate in V1, V4, and PFC, and the power in these different frequency bands. So the results are a little bit complex. I will not detail all of them, but there were different combinations of these markers that were actually in a cross-validated manner predictive of hits versus misses, and the bias of the subject, as well as the sensitivity. I just want to draw your attention to two of these results. So the bias of the animal, whether it's going to report a false alarm, whether it's likely to report a false alarm, was related to the pre-stimulus firing of the neurons. And that makes complete sense, and we can also simulate that in the model. If you have a little bit more pre-stimulus firing, you're more likely to fall into this ignited state, even when there's no stimulus at all. So that was predictive of the bias of the monkey. But the sensitivity is different. The sensitivity relates to fluctuations in the amount of feed-forward activity. You can see it modulating the activity in V4 here, and even in the prefrontal cortex. So the sensitivity is something more like fluctuations in attention. We're probably not measuring directly the source of attention, but we see the effect of attention modulating on a trial-by-trial basis the amount of feed-forward activity evoked by the same stimulus and creating the ability to cross or not cross the threshold. So I think this analysis is quite satisfactory in suggesting that even though we have very indirect measurements in humans with MEG, we are seeing things that relate to single neuron activity that is measurable in the monkey in much simpler paradigms in the monkey, of course. I think I'll skip over this, probably. When you have to stop me, because otherwise I'll just, you know, I'm a mid-sized university, basically. You want to, shall we? Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just skip that, although it's nice. I want to say one word about it. Is that all right? One word, because of course Mike is here, and you will remember this, that this is all about the error negativity. Where is the error negativity? It's here. So when I was here in '93, I was making this analysis of ERPs, and one morning I made this plot. I remember we printed this plot on nice sheets of paper, and I can still see it. And I did, for, you know, just out of caution, I separated the trials into correct and errors for some reaction time task the subject was making. And so I saw there was this huge deflection. I think this is probably some of the original data here. This huge deflection when subject clicked the wrong button and made an error. And this was the error negativity. It's this negativity on the front of the brain here. And I thought I had discovered it. And then Mike was actually reviewing a paper, I think, by Bill Gehring that was publishing exactly this result, which is this very sharp wave that you get on the front of the brain when you make an error and you are able to detect that you make an error, basically. So we recently came back to this effect asking whether there is a relation to consciousness. Is this something that you can do only when you're conscious of the stimulus? And this is basically our best effect that is completely selective for consciousness here. So I won't give you any of the details, but just show you that if we saw trials, depending on whether subjects saw or did not see a stimulus, we get the error negativity only on the conscious trials, not at all on the unconscious trials. So this is perhaps one bit of evidence that consciousness is actually useful. It's not just an epiphenomenon. It is there to help you monitor your task. It helps you to think beyond the first 300 milliseconds. Of course, you can do a lot unconsciously. The first 300 milliseconds is a lot of time for processing. But there is even more, the ability to reflect and to decide whether you've responded correctly or whether you're going to do something different on the next trial and so on and so forth. So I think consciousness is actually a computational system. I'll skip over all of this. Way too long. Clinical applications. Just go to my conclusions. Neuroscience has started to identify objective brain mechanisms of subjective processes, signatures of conscious processing. There's absolutely no contradiction in this. And I want to say that according to this model, maybe this will be what we debate with Christophe, consciousness is just a computational property associated with a certain level of information processing. There is a level 0 of unconscious algorithms, and in fact, I would argue that all that we model in current convolutional neural networks, for instance, is of this kind. It's the feed-forward automatic processing, which is typical of unconscious algorithms. But there is a level 1 of consciousness, which is just conscious access, where a piece of information is amplified, becomes the focus of additional processing. We have an architecture for that in the brain, and there is a second, in this paper, which we might discuss in a few minutes, we propose that this is a level 1 of consciousness which is completely achievable in machines. A system that would be able to share the information across processes. This would be, I think, extremely useful to avoid being grounded in modularity as machines currently are. Machines ignore that they have abilities inside the particular processes that they have. But an architecture that would be able to share the information would be extremely useful. And second, the machine may need to have self-representation. We begin to see that in the case of error processing. The ability to process your error is the first step in what is called self-representation, where the system represents itself. So in this paper, we propose that these computational properties could be mimicked in machines. It's not going to happen just by chance, according to what I presented you in this lecture. It's going to happen if we have the right kind of architecture of information processing, which is similar enough to the one that we have in the human brain. It's not impossible, but it will not emerge spontaneously. With that, I will stop and show you this book where there's a lot more information, and also all these people who did the work. I want to dedicate this lecture just on a little sad note, but Sébastien was a pillar of the lab and just disappeared due to cancer in just 3 months in January, and so I want to dedicate this lecture to him. But thank you very much for your attention. Well, thank you for staying. It's really a long lecture. I'm sorry for that.
We have time for a few questions.
Questions? Yes.
So this ramping that you get because of your averaging across trials, but really the sharp onset on each individual trial, can you see that by looking at single trial data?
So we tried, but the data was a little... Oh, I should repeat the question. Yeah, the question is whether the ramping that we saw on the false alarms, we could actually see that on single trials in the actual data. The answer is no, we could not quite. The data was a little bit too noisy. This is not really single spike data. This is multi-unit spike activity extracted by filtering the local field potentials from a sharp electrode. So it's not good enough to show that. So this is something that should be done in the subsequent work. It was done in the work by Rodrigo Cuyan Quiroga, because they really had single cell recordings. So it should be done again in prefrontal cortex, I guess. Yes?
In the no report tasks, what does it mean to separate between seeing and not seeing stimuli?
So, yeah, well, this is the challenge of no-report paradigms, of course. Yeah, what Fannis Panagiopoulos is doing with the Nikos Logothetis is using nystagmus. This is a very clever thing. So you have, on the left eye, you have a grid that goes up, and on the right eye, you have a grid that goes down. And if the monkey sees the grid that goes up, his eyes follow the grid, and then nystagmus back like this. So in this way, you can tell what the monkey is seeing, or the human, without asking, basically. And this is an excellent no-report paradigm. The other one that I was showing is simply the flashing. If you flash, if you have a fixed picture in one eye and then you flash a picture in the other eye, this is the one that's going to be perceived. So in this case, everybody perceives the same, and you can also use that. Yeah. Mike, you had a question.
Does unconscious working memory take up space in conscious working memory?
Huh. So the question is whether there is interference such that unconscious working memory would take space and compete with conscious working memory. We haven't done that experiment. We did it in the other way, where there was a conscious storage in working memory, and this did not interfere much, if at all, with the unconscious storage. But these experiments remain to be done. I don't even know what the predictions are, because if this is really in synaptic states, there is a lot you can superimpose there, actually. So I don't know whether there would be a sharp limit to this unconscious working memory.
So for this global workspace to work, especially when I think about implementing that in machines, it seems like there is a problem that has to be solved about sort of a common language across modules.
Yeah.
I mean, you have sort of specific modules that do visual processing in one module that do color or
yeah.
sounds. I mean, they're doing completely different things. Do you have certain neurons that then make the connections and that speak a common language, or how is that problem solved?
Yeah, that's a great problem. Yeah, we know that the common language is spikes, of course. This is a minimal language. So what I imagine is you have these vector codes, basically, let's say in prefrontal cortex, for perceived stimulus, and this is broadcasted to so many other areas. It arrives as a pattern of spikes along these axons to each of these areas. Now, the receiving areas still have to make use of that, and I think that's where the learning component is probably essential. Each target area would try to learn to use this top-down broadcasted input. And for some areas it may be usable. Let's say it's a face area and the perceived stimulus has to do with the face or predicts the face, then you could use it. For many other areas, just noise. So they're not going to be able to use it. The point is that there would be a sort of decoder by each receiving area of these broadcasted messages. So you don't need a common language. All you need is the ability to learn to decode these messages separately for each area. And I think it would, for the other areas, it would look as noise, or even though there is a message in there. So the interesting prediction is you should be able to take any processor areas, you would be able to decode these broadcasting messages. There's something that remains to be tested largely, but we tested some of that with intracranial electrodes, and we found that under conscious conditions, many more electrodes were able to decode the stimulus than under unconscious conditions, even talking about sensory electrode in the back of the brain. Yeah. So that's clearly the prediction, that there should be this broadcasted message. Maybe we'll be able to test that with the adversarial experiment that's being planned.
So in machine we have back propagation to propagate errors back, right? So in the brain, probably we don't have back propagation. So do you think this kind of conscious error kind of back propagation is what the brain is implemented?
No, I think error back propagation is an artificial device, basically. I don't know much about this topic, but I think there are some proposals to replace back propagation by a much more realistic learning rule, basically. And there are many proposals, including one by Peter Rufsema, actually, which is essentially a sort of reward-based learning, which is equivalent, which at least converges to a solution which is similar to back propagation. Yeah. So, no, in the actual brain, the top-down signals don't implement back propagation. I think they implement something else, which is prediction. Or broadcasting of information can be used for prediction. Yes.
In the mouse studies, when we present a stimulus and then ask the animal to report whether they receive the stimulus, we change the amplitude of the stimulus, like an auditory stimulus and a visual stimulus, to its maximum chance level, and study the psychophysics of it. You can tell from the mouse whether they're going to report it because they start moving their whiskers a little bit, something on the trough where they are going to say yes. And so with Al Blumenfeld at Yale, we did a study in humans where we gave a face that was at chance level inside place, and then asked the person to report many seconds later whether they saw it or not and where it was. And then we looked at pupil diameter, and you could tell with the pupil diameter whether the person was going to positively report. But also you could tell by the blink rate, the person, they started blinking if they consciously perceived the face. So I'm wondering if these tells are occurring in your humans, and if it could be confounding the neural activity.
Well, it could be a confound or it could be a consequence of this neural activity. And I tend to think more of the latter. So for instance, the pupil, yes, the pupil is often a signature of conscious perception. It seems to relate to a noradrenergic pulse or something like that. And so this is probably part of this ignition process. Some people think it's really the heart of the ignition, that you begin to have this locus coeruleus pulse of activation. But I tend to think more of part of this circle of areas that come together and cause this pupil dilation. Yeah. So in fact, the pupil dilation is a very interesting measure. We know that behaviorally from a long time. Danny Kahneman worked very early on this, but also now it's becoming used in patients. It seems to be that this could be a signature of being conscious in the patients, and this is something that you can measure without much difficulty, actually, in many of the patients.
Yeah, if you show a high-level picture of their grandmother or something in their pupil dilation, so that picture only, you have to say that they have a high level of perception.
Yeah, so well, the way we do it is with the auditory stimuli that have particular content. Yeah, but it's a similar idea. Yeah. Should we?
Well, this might be a good time to ask Christoph to.
All right, so how about, so I prepared 2 slides since I had a little bit more advance notice than you did of this. So I prepared 2 slides, and I'll tell you about it. And please, Stan, intervene. At any time I say something wrong, please correct me, because we are engaged in something that's quite new. So independent what you think about consciousness and its neural basis, this is also a new sort of an experiment in the sociology of science. And I've talked to a few people who are naive about science, they say, well, isn't this how science always happens? And of course it's not. So it's called an adversarial collaboration because the basic idea is you get together two proponents of two different theories, that claim to explain something similar, and then try to get them all in one room and hammer out agreement about a set of experiments that would somehow disambiguate some aspect or other of the particular theories and get them to commit in writing ahead of time that yes, if it's this outcome, this theory will be supported. If it's that outcome, that theory will be supported. And then write a pre-registered report, get it submitted and get it accepted, and then do the actual science using a large number of subjects, so it's highly reliable, statistically reliable, and where you get independent labs. So they're now the two theories are integrated information theory that I talked about and global neuronal workspace theory that Stan talked about, and get two other labs to participate in this, to get them funded, and to have for each experiment at least two labs that do the analysis, to collect all the data, make it available to everybody as part of the collaboration, and then do the analysis. But every lab has access to every data and all the tools because you've agreed ahead of time on the exclusion criteria, on the statistics that you're going to use, etc. So you can think of it as an experiment in sociology of science. The first time I read about it is a beautiful classic experiment in the history of science, 1919. Few of you will know about it. It's a classical experiment led by an expedition by Arthur Eddington, who was the chief astronomer at the time in England just after World War I, and they were going to test Einstein's theories of general relativity, which made a prediction about when the sun was going to be a full solar eclipse. There were three specific predictions. They outlined them ahead of time and precisely calculated the deviation of a star that would be included based on either Newton's theory of gravity, based on Einstein's special relativity, and based on Einstein's general relativity. And then they went to Brazil and then to an island just off the east coast of Africa to try to test them. And it's spectacular. So can we do something similar? So last year, under the guidance of this program author, David Podgieter, who's a biologist in background, but he's now program author at the Templeton World Charity Foundation. So they organized this. We had a meeting at my institute in Seattle. So the people are really taking the lead are three young scientists, Lucia Meloni, she's between the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt and NYU. Liat Mudrik, she's a young professor at Tel Aviv University, and Michael Pitts, who's here in Oregon, up at Reed College. And then together with a large number of PIs, so there's Stan and then Giulio Tononi, and then a large number of people who are actually going to do the analysis of this data. There are really two visual psychology experiments of the sort that Stan talked about, using three separate techniques. So one is fMRI, the second one is EEG, MEG, and the third one, this is a normal subject, and the third one is ECOG in epileptic patients that have these electrode array implants. It's a large number of subjects. It's a big study. It's a big experiment. The Templeton is funding it, and it's going to be pre-registered. And as I said, each experiment is done by two labs and all data shared. So it's really a pretty cool thing, I submit. And they're trying to get more foundations and ultimately more people to accept this idea of an adversarial collaboration where you don't have theories and people talking past each other, because most people, most of the time, test their own ideas, right? It's just the reality. But where you actually get together, we disagree. Well, let's see whether we can actually clear up our disagreement. And the difference, sort of at the high level, what are we trying to test here? because they're different theories, IT and GNW, they're very different. One is a process theory, the other one not. The other one is sort of more based on formal axiomatic approach. The other one is sort of more, trying to explain actual data from MEG and EG and other data. So they're sort of different animals, but they both claim to explain aspects to some extent of consciousness. Now, of course, all theories we know are wrong. It's just how wrong are they? Are they both wrong? Are they both have aspects of reality? That's probably the truth, and which one. So here the idea is the signature of consciousness, what I call the NCCs. So it's going to be focused on the NCCs. Where they are, those signatures? Are they in various different parts of the brain? What's the exact timing? Is there an ignition? So let me see. These are the first experiment. So the idea is that, so this is a take on an earlier experiment, but the idea is that you have a single stream of stimuli that are perfectly visible. So each stimulus by itself is fully visible, high contrast, but some are task relevant and some are target. So you get two categories. So for example, you have a category, let's say, of faces and of objects in one variant. Or another you get a particular, you have just letters and false fonts, and you're being told to look out for A and to look out for that mirror and that J. Okay? Those are your targets. So they could either be in the relevant category, which is letters and false font. So in those cases, those would be distractors, or they could be a B, which is in the same class, the same category, but it's not your target letter. Right, so you have three sort of classes of stimuli. You have classes of stimuli that are target. You've got classes of stimuli that are in the same category but are non-target, and then you got totally different visual stimuli. So this is one. And the other manipulation that you do, you're changing, is the duration, 500,000, 1,500 milliseconds. And so the idea is to do this using these different techniques and to measure this. And then there's a variety of different predictions. So as you heard, Stan, arguing that this is ignition, and so the ignition is early on. You saw the data, 250, very convincing data. Right? Add around 250, 300 milliseconds. There is this ignition, but the question, for example, what happens here? There's an early ignition here, but there's this sustained stimulus. So this is, for example, one aspect where IT and DW differ, because IT says, well, as long as you're conscious of something, there will be an NCC that fires with exactly, with all the correlates that you're conscious of. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, where is it going to be? Can you do the decoding for the aspects that are relevant to your conscious perception? Can you do that best? Where's the best place where you can do that, and how does it relate to the target detection? Is that in the posterior parts of the brain, like precuneus or posterior area, inferior temporal, fusiform face area, or is that in some of the prefrontal areas, ACC or classical prefrontal, Brodmann area 8 to 12, 44. And then also, as you saw in the very last monkey experiment that Stan talked about, there are different predictions that the two theories make about the precondition. What is it just before the stimulus? What is the correlate whether you actually have visibility or not as a function of what occurs before? So this is one experiment. The second experiment is a video experiment. It's now being finalized. It's much more dynamic.
Can I ask a quick question about this experiment? How does this differ? It seems like this is the kind of experiment that's been done a million times already, right?
I completely agree, actually.
So, didn't we just see a bunch of data for experiments very similar to this?
No, for instance, what's different here is not a threshold data. So there's one type of experiment that Stan has shown, where you have stimuli that are just barely visible or not barely visible, right? They're low contrast, or you flash in very little time. This is very different. Here, you have stimuli that are on that are high contrast, that can be on up to 1,500 milliseconds. So it's not a stimulus that's barely visible, right? You also vary this interval, and then you have this difference between task relevant and are they not task relevant? Because the big thing is, how do I dissociate stimuli that force me to respond that are relevant, but that I see from those that are not relevant, but I also see both cases I clearly see the stimulus, but only in one case are they actually relevant to the performance of the task. Now, if, to me at least, the correlate of conscience, in both cases, if I see it, there's going to be a correlate of conscience in both cases. In the second case, when the task relevant, there will also be a correlate of the task relevancy, you know, including the button press and everything else. And so dissociating that in one way, in one clean experiment, doing different techniques that emphasize different spatial, temporal, and coverage and domain hasn't been done before. So that's one experiment.
Yeah, actually some of it has been done before, but so it's a critique for me actually of this experiment. I have to say, first of all, I love the idea of adversarial experiment. We had a good time in Seattle, thanks to you, Christophe, to get together and to discuss these issues. I'm a little bit disappointed by the end result, which I think is a pretty normal experiment in the end. It's just perhaps done on a bigger scale and with a little bit more thinking ahead, you know, but it's still, I agree with you, it's the normal style of experiment. So for instance, we already know that there can be prefrontal cortex activation to target irrelevant dimension of the stimulus. There is this beautiful paper by Monte, Chenoy, and so on, where they see this color and motion stimulus going into the prefrontal cortex and so on. So it's not that we don't have any data, and to some extent, perhaps better data could be collected in the monkey, for instance. So this is all in humans, and it's therefore not going to be single-cell data. It's only going to be indirect data, in a sense. So these are all qualifications that we could have here.
Yeah, so there's a second workshop being planned now in again at the Allen, the same foundation, on doing things like that using either rodents or monkeys.
Yeah.
Try to do something similar, possible with a different set of people in animals.
Yeah, I think that could be, because the techniques that could be deployed could be much better.
Well, they're much more powerful, but also you can do interventions. You can do optogenetics.
Have you considered that you get results from both of you? You need the frontal activation to
Right. In fact, that's another source of disappointment for me. It's, I'm not even sure that the two theories are incompatible. In fact, they are on such different planes that they could actually be completely compatible. That what we call broadcasting involves also a significant dimension of enhancing the causal powers or the spread of the stimulus and the phi complexity and so on and so forth. So it's quite possible, actually. And if I may say, a real source of problem. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I? Could I just go back? Yeah, that's what I was trying to do.
This one?
Yeah. Why not? Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly. One source of disappointment for me, which makes me a bit cautious about these experiments, is I think the predictions of the global workspace theory are quite precise, maybe too precise. But the predictions of IIT I was disappointed from, to be honest. I think that IIT is not really computable to such an extent that we can really make very precise predictions. None of the theories are comparable to Einstein's theory, by the way, where we can really get a precise quantitative assessment of how far a star could have moved or something like that. We are very far from that. But for instance, in the first line where you say IIT predicts that activity in posterior areas is necessary, but not prefrontal cortex, this is not a derivation from the axioms of IIT at all. It's not a computation because the measures of phi and so on are not computable at the very moment, right? So it's all a sort of second-hand derivation from your hunch or Giulio's hunch that the more posterior areas are more needed. It's not really like you can compute this theory and make these very precise predictions. So in that respect, I think we may find out that in the end, the two theories are compatible with the data. We will see. We try to make them as separate as possible.
For me, the greatest thing about it, coming from the Allen Institute, of course, I strongly believe in open science. I think it's done all too rarely. I think science should be done many more by, if I have a particular theory, it would be far best if other people test my theory, because of course I'm biased towards finding positive results. So partly why I really like this, because of the entire sociology. Plus, I think that whatever the result is, it'll teach us something about seen and unseen, about task relevant and not task relevant. I agree with Stan, given the granularities of the theory in the different animals, testing them precisely under the same circumstance, like you can do Newton versus Einstein, currently is simply not,
It's not quite there.
in the cards. So.
Can we make a comment about the last prediction here, because we have some data that speaks to this. We've asked mice to perceive a threshold auditory stimulus inside a noise and report their perception of that. And then we recorded an auditory cortex and watched their pupil diameter and measured their accuracy. And we found that the pupil diameter and the spontaneous firing rate of the auditory cortex predicted the animal's ability to do the task. And the best state was for the animal to be moderately aroused and the auditory cortex to be very quiet. If the animal was drowsy, the auditory cortex was doing slow wave activity as it would be in the drowsy, and then he did poorly. And if the animal was very aroused, there was lots of spontaneous activity in the auditory cortex, and the performance went down again. So, you know, but you have to be careful because it's the type of activity. It's not just the presence of activity. It's the type of activity that's going on preceding the trial that's going to have different effects. I don't want to just look at just the presence of activity. It's hard to do it EEG or fMRI, but
No, I agree with you. I think there is a lot of work to do to characterize the different, you call them background conditions under which something might be perceived or not. And the first experiment that Christophe showed is all about this no-report paradigm. So the suggestion is that the stimuli are visible, therefore they are seen. I have a little bit of trouble with that because I think we know about the inattention literature that if you are not attending, you might be totally unaware of stimuli, even though they are being presented under visible conditions. So in one of our papers, we make this distinction between visible and seen. Visible means it's potentially accessing the workspace, but seen means it's actually accessing the workspace. And this experiment cannot really tell because it's not asking the subject, you know, to report visibility. So I'm a little bit worried about this part.
Even though it's a single target on an empty screen that's highly visible.
Yeah, so,
500
well,
milliseconds or 1500 milliseconds.
Yeah, so I think we agree at the end that we maximize the conditions for it to work. But if there was an invisible gorilla in this experiment, you know, this could still happen. So if the subject thinks of his grandmother or something like that, or has taxes to return or something like that, there might be some invisible stimuli in there.
I would actually be interested in, instead of focusing on the differences, it occurred to me when I listened to your talk and to your talk, there is actually quite a bit of common, ideas behind those theories. So in your theory, it's you only are experience. You have one unified experience. I mean, that's very much seems to resonate with the global workspace idea. So the main difference that I saw is the anatomical and this idea of the causal, which I'm not sure how that translates directly into experimental, into empirical data. So I'm curious to not just focus on the difference, but also the commonality.
So the causal, the anatomical difference right now, I agree with Stan, it's based on it's not directly derived from the theory, it's based on the analysis of some clinical literature, particularly the one to lesion and electrical stimulation that may or may not tell us the right thing, because all of these experiments, we know they are all second-order adaptation effect and whatnot. So I wouldn't push that so far. Causal power in principle you can test. You can look at, at the relevant level, let's say neurons, and you can manipulate neurons using optogenetics or electrical stimulation or magnetic fields, whatever. You can actually measure, if you provide different sorts of input, how much causal power does one input or two input or three input have? So in principle you can measure.
The result from the error negativity, which if Stan is right, is a conscious phenomenon, but we also know that the error negativity is something that has downstream effects on subsequent processing. So even there, it seems like maybe there are you call it differently, but this is an example where a critical piece of that theory has there's a causal mechanism built in there.
In principle, yes. One thing where the theories differ greatly is some of the implication regarding to the ontological commitment to various things. This might be a weakness of one theory or of the other theory. I admit, I can see it in both lights. So the characteristic of IT is it makes very strong commitments to ontology, to what exists, what doesn't exist, what is a whole, what's not a whole, that may be completely mistaken. It may be way too premature, or, and this approach might be right. But it does have some implication, for example, if we think about machines. So, Stan's last statement, because IIT has a strong prediction that it's not about simulating. Okay, it's not a computational state, it's a physical state of a thing, of a physical system, in this case a brain. So if you wanted to get computer conscious, you have to build it into the hardware, not in the simulation. There's no question in 10 or 20 years' time we'll get Alexa, or we'll get, Henry Markham or whoever does it is going to do a super sophisticated model of all the human brain, right? There's no question in the fullness of time that's happened. And of course this model will have everything that we see in humans, because if it's the right model, it will have it. But ultimately, that's just code that's execute. It's just behavior. It's just like, as I said in my talk, it's just like simulating a black hole. You can simulate the effect of gravity, but you don't get the causal power of gravity. So this is where the theories differ. But right now, that's impossible to test. Right? It's an interesting prediction. You can write books about it, novels, and people are doing that, and maybe make movies. But it's not scientific right now. Given the current state of we have, is not amenable to any real empirical test.
I think I disagree with that, actually, so I'm not sure. But
So we disagree.
so first of all, I can imagine a machine that has causal powers. First of all, this notion of causal power seems to me ill-defined. So even in a simulation, there is, if you analyze it as a physical system, you'd say there is causal power. There is causal power of the electrons in a computer to move other electrons, right? So it seems to me the theory, as the IIT theory, wants to be at this level where you could describe any physical system where the causality is actually the same in the simulation as it is in the brain. Maybe it's no. I hear no.
It's coming from here.
No.
I have a challenge for both of you. Picture a cartoon of a machine submerged in the no sensory, whatever it's called.
Immersion tank? Flotation tank?
Picture the machine submerged in this tank, okay? And then each of you give me, the caption for that cartoon. You don't have to do it right now. Just think about it. It's a perfect cartoon.
This is Oregon for me.
Well, today the computer will be short circuit because it's wet. It's salt water.
Yeah.
It's salt water, which is really bad for any machine.
I'll give you another metaphor. In a science paper we discuss machines, we try to think of what would it be like for a car to be conscious. I think it's a much more realistic situation, actually. So we'll have self-driving cars. And will they be conscious or not? At the moment, I think no. I think it's just, especially if they are feed-forward neural networks driving, they're not conscious. What would it take for them to be conscious? Well, for one thing, I would like them to be alert to their own capacities. So this is this global workspace idea that if there is information in one system, it should be available to the whole system. So we take the example of the gas light. If you have a gas light in a current car, it's computed by a whole electronics and so on, but it's completely unconscious because none of the other systems in the car are aware, receive this information. I shouldn't use the word aware, but receive this information that the car is going out of gas. So imagine now a car that has this ability to share this information, use it in a sort of intelligent manner. I think we would say that the car is aware that he's going out of gas. And the second thing is, imagine the car now, you wake up in one morning, it's all foggy. Or maybe another example is the car has a broken radar. Okay, I would like the car to be able to say, sorry, but this morning I can't drive. It's outside of the conditions of my learning, or my radar is broken. I am unable to drive this morning. I would much rather prefer the car to say this than to just start driving and be under dangerous conditions. So I think we're going to have cars like this. That are going to have some kind of self-monitoring system and sharing of information, which are these two essential properties, I think. And for my part, I'm perfectly happy with calling such a car conscious. I think perhaps some of the disagreement is that we have this sort of essential abilities, essential properties that we attribute to consciousness. We think there is always something more, but I think it's a graded distinction that we are making here. I think it's a computation, or it's about how far the machine is able to compute. And I think, therefore, that you will find that at least the users of these machines, they will readily attribute consciousness to these machines.
That is true.
And
I totally agree with you.
yes, but maybe that's all there is.
No. Of course, all the difference in the world is not whether you say you're conscious, but whether you actually are conscious and have conscious experience. But I know that's just...
Well, that's exactly where we disagree. Yeah. Sure.
So according to your theories, could we have perfect, let's call them automatons, that behave like humans, we cannot tell them apart from the other humans we have, but they don't have consciousness? Or does the theory say that, no, you do need the consciousness for us to be able to kind of include?
There's no question that in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time, give enough time, Alexa, if we just stick with speech for now, right? This is human property. Alexa will be indistinguishable. She'll have all the poise. You won't be able to tell it's a synthetic voice. She tells all the joy, all the jokes. She does all the hum and humming that Google does already, Google Assistant. So it will be complete. It will pass the Turing test. It'll be completely indistinguishable from us. Sooner or later, it's going to happen, sooner than we think, right? But I think it doesn't feel like anything. It's still, you can ask her today, in fact, you can do it. Are you conscious? And she say, yeah, I feel happy or something, whatever. It's all fake. It's all simulated.
Yeah. And the reason I'm asking is, since you're interacting with these things, and they may or may not have consciousness, but you're interacting with me and you assume I have consciousness, but only because I tell you so.
No,
doesn't matter.
No. The big difference is I do what's called abduction, okay? I abduce consciousness to you. Why? Because your brain is very similar to my brain. Your behavior is statistically similar to my behavior. Your genome is very similar to mine, right? So you're in some sense very, very similar to me, right? To the sense that you're very, very different from me. You have a very different hardware. You have a very totally different evolutionary history. That inference, that abduction becomes more and more difficult. That's why you need, finally you need some sort of fundamental theory to tell you any piece of matter that you encounter in the universe, here or there on the alien sky, does it feel like something to be this particular piece, piece of furniture of the universe? And that's why I think ultimately we need a fundamental theory, not just a process theory, but a theory that tells us fundamentally what does it take for this piece to be conscious, to feel like something. That's what I think.
Is that the same from the other side, or you think that the automaton can exist?
Yeah, I think the automaton can exist. I think all of this discussion is based on misguided intuitions, which we are raised in a culture of dualism, basically, from the start. Perhaps it's also, some people have claimed that it's part of our endowment, actually, that babies, for instance, immediately distinguish between objects versus people. And we tend to think of people as radically different from objects. So we have trouble understanding that machines could be what we call people. I think along these lines, I think that we will have to revise our intuitions of consciousness and especially of the mind. Basically, what the whole cognitive science story is about reducing the mind to operations of information processing. But we still are not willing to jump, in the pool and to say, well, this is it, And philosophers like Dan Dennett, I'm very influenced by Dan Dennett, tell us that, yes, we can jump in the pool. There is no such thing as zombies. What you are describing is the philosophical zombie. A machine that would behave completely identical to every human. David Chalmers even says, it's atom by atom, identical to human, but it's not conscious. Well, this is a contradiction in terms, I think. If a certain level of information processing is achieved, I think the machine is conscious by definition. And by the way, we can imagine all of the intermediates. We're already replacing, in the dish at least, some neurons by digital inputs. This experiment has been done. You can mimic the environment of other neurons for a physical, biological neuron gets inputs from a simulation. So where does it stop? Why do you need the biological tissue in order to have consciousness?
About biological tissue per se, I totally agree. If you build, for example, a neuromorphic computer, where you take one transistor that projects to 10,000 other transistors rather than 3 or 4 like on a classical CPU or ALU or TPU, and where it gets input from tens of thousands others, and they have massively overlap. If you replicate the causal architecture of the human brain, you'll get consciousness. It's nothing. There's nothing magic about.
Okay, good. So we agree on that. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not saying there's a soul in a classic Catholic sense. No, there isn't. But the soul 2.0 also is not going to live in the soul. I hate to disappoint people who believe in uploading and all of that, Ray Kurzweil and all of that's not going to happen. Yes, you could do it at some point if you run on sufficient powerful computers, but they'll all be zombies. That's right. They'll all be raptured into the digital zombiehood.
There are many arms raised.
We can all agree on one thing. It's time to have some altering.
Oh, is it? All right, good.
What?
Would you guys be okay with just a few more minutes?
Sure.
Oh, sure, as you wish. There are many questions, actually, many raised arms. Yeah, Oh.
So for many of us, there's an elephant in the room here that hasn't been discussed, and that's an area of what some people associate with as an essential or non-reducible aspect of consciousness that sets fundamental limits of what neuroscience is. And that's the issue of qualia. Neither of you have, in developing your theories, have directly used the term and given us an account of how that phenomenon fits in or doesn't fit in with your theory. I challenge you to do that now.
I think I talked about qualia in the sense of subjective perception. I started with a visual illusion where there's very strong qualia of gray level, and we didn't simulate exactly that experiment or study it in the lab, but similar ones where you perceive or not perceive the particular physical attribute of the stimuli. I think this is all there is to qualia. I never, in 20 years of discussion about consciousness with the best philosophers, I've never been able to come with one definition of qualia that I could bring to the lab and study, other than that. Subjective visual illusion. So, this is it, I think.
Qualia, of course, is the heart of the problem, right? And IT says qualia is just a different name for the specific accents. In the broad sense, qualia, in the narrow sense, it's just a different way of particular type of visual experience. So if I have the experience of red, it's a particular qualia associated. It's really the same thing. And IT says every qualia in the sense lato sensu stricto of any one experience will have a counterpart in the intrinsic causal effect. So you unfold it. So Julie, there's a paper coming out by IT where they've done this beautifully. They take a simple network that has one-dimensional and two-dimensional grid, and they explain the phenomenology of space, how visual space is. You look at space. Space is extended, space is neighborhood, there are distance metrics, right? All of that we associate with experience, with the quality of the way space feels, whether it's visual space or auditory space or touch space, right? There's always something common. And IIT tries in a systematic way to map those various qualitative features of our experience of space onto the causal power unfolded by simple one- or two-dimensional network of interconnected neurons. It's really very elegant. And the theory says you map every aspect of qualia onto every aspect of this internal causal structure. There's nothing left over on either side. They're completely identical. It's an identity theory.
Okay, so if you guys are both going to concede that the automata are possible, right?
What?
You guys both concede that the automata are possible. That there could be a physical system like Alexa in the future that passes a Turing test or whatnot. But then there are systems like us where we have qualia, we have subjective experience. So do you guys have like a hypothesis about why in some cases like the qualia having system has been selected for so strongly when it's hypothetically this you can have identical systems?
No.
Why?
No, they're not physically identical. They're identical in terms of input-output behavior. It's a big difference, right? Alexa is very different from me.
Yeah.
It doesn't have alarming, so it's not the same physical system. So of course, if I have two identical physical systems, if one is conscious, the other one will also be conscious. There's no question about it. But if you have one real system and the other one simulates the former system, consciousness does not transfer because IT says it's not a computational property. This is where IT and global neuron workspace differ.
Can perform the same behavior.
Yes.
Natural selection. Why would one be selected
Oh, because it's extremely unlikely, under the generic condition that nature operates, that those sort of systems will evolve. Any sort of system, you know, if you simulate the natural selection, it's a random search through space, right? So it's going to, the type of architecture this random search will come up with are heavily recurrent, you know, pseudo-random neural networks that have sort of topography superimposed. And those, if they're actually physically instantiated, as they have to be in real biological creatures, they will come with intrinsic causal power with high phi. That's why we evolved.
So it's less likely for...
Extremely, yes. You don't sort of generically derive such a neuron that happens to do exactly the same as over there, but this radical different, digital phenomenon architecture. You can build it, but you're not going to find it through random search by evolution.
So I see two more questions now, and I think then we'll should. So here and here. So I don't know who goes first.
The question for Stan. The data is really interesting because it's very specific, but I'm curious because most of it's in the context.
Can you speak up?
Your data is interesting, but it's mostly in the context of like visual perception over like shorter timescales. So I'm curious to see if you have the same sort of predictions for like multimodal information or more vivid representations of like memory reactivation. And like, would you have the same specific precise predictions for those different types of like experience, for instance?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think the predictions would be similar. For instance, in the case of memory reactivation, I think it's a very good example. There is, this is not my field, but as far as I understand it, when you retrieve a memory, you go from this dormant state to this sort of ignited state, and it does invade the same sort of regions that we've seen in perception. So you can think of it as an ignition. In fact, this has been described at the intracranial level as an ignition when you retrieve, for instance, the memory that you've seen, The Simpsons, in a past movie. You see this sudden ignition, yeah. So it seems to fit, yeah. And if it is multimodal, well, that's interesting. So there's probably multimodal processes outside of the workspace. So the theory is not that any time there is an integration, there is consciousness. That's clearly not the case. There can be processes that are multimodal. For instance, the McGurk illusion, I think, is a good example where there is computation before conscious perception, which must imply that there's been conscious integration of auditory and visual unconscious information integration of auditory and visual information before you access it. You access the result consciously. So in that respect, I know there is one paper circulating in archives right now which makes exactly the wrong prediction. I think it's not a prediction of global workspace that anytime there is integration, there should be consciousness.
So a lot of people think about memory and perception as like lower level processes, right? And then you have sort of higher things like sort of semantic information or emotional experience. So like, do you predict the same? Do you have the same type of quantitative predictions for like the onset of emotion? Do you have this sort of ignition of the sort of subjective feeling of happiness or sadness, or ignition of the semantic representation of something that's like stimulus?
Yeah. I'd like to stick my neck out and think that this is the case. Yeah, exactly. So you have to distinguish conscious versus unconscious emotion. But the moment you become aware of a particular emotion, like let's say fear, you can have a lot of unconscious fear. The moment you become conscious of your fear, there should be an ignition. That would be my prediction. But I should mention that all of these predictions are for a surprising stimulus. So a novel stimulus that forces you to refresh your internal model. It's a very interesting question what happens when you have a predictable stimulus, the predictable conscious stimulus. I don't think you get a P3, you get minimal refresh, so it's all a completely different area. So I should have said that all I'm speaking about is about perception of an external stimulus.
For many minutes now,
yeah.
2 hours or more.
It's boring, I know.
Yeah, I still see you consciously.
Yeah.
You don't disappear, so the ignition must have passed.
Yeah, so maybe now you get a few more updates. I don't know about details of my face, but most of what you're seeing is an internal model. That's what I would claim. And so the reason we don't see a big P3 for a predictable stimulus is there is nothing to refresh. There's very little refresh. You already have the internal model running, basically. Some people say no.
It's refreshing all the time. Why would you think that he sees you as he saw you 2 hours ago? No, he sees you, if he chooses to have a vigilance, he will see you anew in the present as you're unfolding.
So it's actually a prediction of the model. This is the thing I'm excited about in this first experiment that Christophe was showing, is if we have a long image and you're looking at it for 2 seconds, my model predicts that you're not conscious of it all the time. You don't have to. You just need to refresh your workspace initially, and then you can think of something else. And that's...
It's complex. The image is complex. It's not just one.
If it is complex, then maybe, when you're looking at a painting... Yeah.
These are these images. Right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, so if you see the letter A, you see the letter A, and then you can go on thinking about your grandmother. That's, yeah.
well, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
The proof of the pudding is in the eating.
Yeah, so one main difference between machines and humans is that they don't need to sleep.
They don't need...
Sleep.
I didn't get it.
Machines, they don't need to sleep.
Yeah.
So, what is the role of, what do you think the physiological role of sleep?
Well, we evolved on a planet with circadian rhythm. Things change dramatically, right? Your entire environment changes, temperature changes, visibility changes. So every creature on this planet had to adopt to circadian rhythm. Machines don't have to do that because we are building them.
Oh, and I think I disagree, but for completely unrelated reasons to IIT. But I think there is a lot of evidence that sleep relates to learning. And maybe actually machines will need some kind of sleep-wake cycle. There are already several algorithms for sleep-wake cycle in learning. You need sometimes to put the machine off and reorganize its representation. And it seems to be perhaps what sleep is about. It's so universally present, including outside of the circadian rhythm. It can be on a much faster rhythm, the sleep-wake cycle. So I think it has something very fundamental to do about the way you reorganize the machine periodically in order to adapt to the learning.
It's also present, so 10% of all your genes in your body, not just in your brain, in your kidney and everywhere else are modulated by circadian rhythm. So it's a universal property of all cells, right? There's a clock, we now know there was a Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, there's a universal clock in every one of our cells that, has a circadian rhythm. So I think it's a fundamental property. There's definitely in us in mammals or in higher animals, there is this learning thing. But I don't see how it should directly relate to consciousness either way.
No, I agree.
Well, I'm just trying to say that it's a main difference between machines and...
Well, there are a few other differences. I mean, right now they look quite different to ones, and it's a minor difference. So you have to update them all the time. You have to reboot them constantly. You get the screen of death that you don't get. Huge differences.
So I think we can all agree this was an absolute highlight.
Well, that was fun.